Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start right at 4. Thank you all for coming. I am so excited to see so many people in Cary Hall again. And it's nice that most of us are wearing masks to help other people, or you've spread out. In Cary Hall, you can do that. And this is the place in town meeting, where town meeting is held. It's set up exactly like this. And this is where those decisions made that Bill talks about in his book. I want to welcome you all to Lexington. I'm Ricky Pappo. I'm chair of the Lexington Climate Action Network, or we call it LexCAN. LexCAN began in this room. E.O. Wilson came here to talk to us about his book, The Future of Life. This book raised the issue of climate change and the explosive loss of biodiversity. A few wise folks, and some of them are in the audience right now, said, why don't we start a group to talk about climate change, to do something about climate change, and began this organization. Back then, it was called GWAC. Some of you may remember when it was the Global Warming Action Coalition. We recently changed our name to LexCAN because we wanted to have climate action in the name. So we welcome Bill back to Lexington. If you all were watching the slideshow, you saw how many partners we have in putting this on, and I'm sure we would have had more if we had the time to ask more groups. I also want to encourage you all, we have a box outside for Bill's new venture, which is called Third Act. If you could donate some money after the talk, all that money, 100%, goes to the organization and for the running of the organization. But to introduce Bill, we have Fran Ludwig. Many of you know, yes. Fran is our other environmental Lexington hero. And many of you know her through your kids who went to school and did Big Backyard and many other things. But Fran spent her career as a science educator in the schools, and one of her students in 8th grade science was Bill McKibben at Clark Middle School. So she was his teacher on science, and I actually think that's where it all began, Bill. But Fran, who's now the current co-chair of the LexCAN Advocacy Committee, which has been very busy if you get our emails, she was also with Bill in Washington, D.C. in August 2011, during an act of civil disobedience against the pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline, they were both arrested. So they have a lot in common, and please welcome Fran Ludwig to introduce Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Ricky. I'm so excited to welcome back Bill McKibben, and the person without whom we would not be here, Bill McKibben's mom, Peggy. So Bill spent many of his formative years in Lexington, and in his book, he describes the impact that has had on his life and as a consequence on our lives as well. He's a climate activist. He's a writer, very prolific. He is a co-founder of 350.org, which has demonstrations all around the globe, so he's impactful on the global scene as well. He's a founder of his most recent project, Third Act, and you'll hear more about that later. As Ricky mentioned, I was his 8th grade science teacher at Clark Middle School, and when I recall Bill from those days, he had a head of curly hair. And my memory of his class was that they were trying to make the world's largest chocolate chip cookie for the Guinness Book of World Records. I don't know if they succeeded, Bill, but they did. Oh, great. So he wasn't always an environmentalist. But he certainly has had such an impact since those days. Over the years, he's influenced me far more than I ever influenced him at Clark. I next encountered Bill probably 15 years later or so when I read his disturbing book, The End of Nature. And as a science teacher, I should have known this, but I didn't really see the future implications. Where he described that there are now, and especially now, no places on Earth that have not been touched by human impact, and in many ways, negative impact, unfortunately. In his new book, Bill continues to challenge us. And as I read the book, I realized that I lived in Lexington, or taught in Lexington, for many of the years that he describes. And I really don't have a recollection of those times, which tells you I was heads down as a young teacher, a young parent, and I just didn't pay attention. And I think the message of this book is we need to pay attention. Everybody needs to pay attention, and they need to take action. So I'm going to let Bill tell you now how Lexington's story is really a cautionary tale and what we must do now to stabilize our planet and our democracy. Bill, we look forward to hearing you.
Fran, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming in out of the day on a Sunday afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. In fact, really almost more of a nostalgic pleasure than I'd been thinking. I'd been saying to Mom as we walked in that for many years, through 2 or 3 years, when I was in junior high or early high school, and I was very interested in politics even then and things political. And this room was really kind of, although I'd forgotten it, sort of my school for that. I would come during town meeting week after week and watch. I'd sit up there in that corner right there, and I mean, this was in the days before cell phones and things, so you really had to watch, you know, and learned a little bit about my neighbor, George Silverman, who was a town meeting member from Precinct 9, next door neighbor would drive me there and back, and I would absorb and think and learn. And it was a good school for learning about politics because there was conflict, but it was gently managed in the way that one would hope. And I've since gone on to live in very small New England towns where we get to have actual town meeting, where everybody comes to town meeting, and I'm grateful for those expressions of democracy. Now, I'm aware that this makes me sound like an odd human being who would have been better off going to watch a basketball game or something, but in fact, I did that too. I covered the basketball team for the Minuteman in its great and glorious run to the state championship in 1978 with Mark Nesline and Tom Sullivan and Gene Mewborn winning the state championship. And the same week, my partner Robin Jacobson and I won the state debate championship for the first time. I believe that Lexington has won it every single year since. But since it was the first time, it was received with, so there was a big party here for both the basketball team and the debate team here in Cary Hall, and I remember it well. But of course, the time that I remember really first and deepest from this room is the one that I describe in the beginning of this book. And it was on that night in 1971 when the Vietnam veterans against the war, led by lanky, charismatic, impossibly young Lieutenant John Kerry, just returned from the war, wanted to stage their protest on Lexington Green. And the town fathers said, no, people assembled here in Cary Hall for an informational meeting where the selectmen were going to explain why they weren't going to let people camp on the green overnight, bivouac there as a protest. And it sticks in my memory because it was the first time I'd ever seen adults, I was 10, I think, at the time, really angry with each other and up and yelling. And it was a night of extraordinary high emotion because the stakes, of course, were high. The Vietnam War was raging at its highest. And of course, I remember what happened afterwards when the selectmen said that they were going to arrest people on the green, that the good people of Lexington turned out in their hundreds to get arrested alongside those people from the VVAW. And that my father, though it was not at all the sort of thing he did, was one of those who went and got arrested. It remains the biggest action of civil disobedience in the history of Massachusetts, those arrests. And of course, it sunk in very deep for me. One of the reasons that it sunk in deep, I think, was that it seemed to be of a piece with where America was going. If you had asked me in my kind of intuitive but inchoate way as a young person in America at that time, it seemed like this was an expression of the kind of creative tension at work in America on this project of making it a better place. A project that had kind of grown out of the Depression and the Second World War and then gone on through the 60s, through this project that LBJ called the creation of the Great Society, or that Dr. King called the beloved community, and a work that was going always with tension and conflict, but on many fronts advancing. These were the years of the apex of the civil rights movement. And Dr. King came here to Lexington in 1963, a few months before the March on Washington, to give a talk to thousands of people in the high school auditorium. These were the years when we were beginning for the first time to take women seriously as part of public life in this country. These were the years of the first Earth Day, 1970. 20 million Americans, 10% of the then population of the United States, was out in the streets on that day in April protesting. And when I say that it seemed to be, though full of conflict, a moment when things were working, that's a good example. Within a year of those Earth Day protests, the U.S. Congress, with a Republican president, had agreed on the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and they had passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. That was a marvel. Those things became the templates for governments across the world to figure out how to clean up their air and water. And indeed, air and water are endlessly cleaner than they were in 1970. So things, again, in a kind of inchoate, intuitive way, accessible to a young person, things seem to be on this kind of roll, this sort of momentum in the direction of a place that was going to keep getting steadily better. The country that was going to keep steadily getting better. However, though I didn't really sense it at the time, there was another counter tide going on at the same time, and beginning to grow in strength. And that's the other story I tell at the beginning of this book from the same year, that same spring of 1971, just a few weeks away from that demonstration on the green. Lexington had another big controversy, the controversy over whether or not to approve affordable housing in this town. Now, it had started sort of momentum building for it again early in the 1960s. Dr. King came to town. After his visit, there was a sense that action was needed on civil rights. People in Lexington, by the thousands, signed an open letter renouncing the restrictive covenants that were on some deeds in town and saying, this is an open housing community, anyone can live where they want. In fact, People went on to form, and I like this name, the Suburban Responsibility Commission in Lexington. And they took as their first role trying to figure out how to break down some of the segregation that afflicted and afflicts the Boston area. There have been voluntary efforts at things like Metco, which began in the mid-60s as an effort to at least begin to diversify the schools a little bit, but people were well aware that Lexington was lily white and very affluent. And so they began work on this plan for affordable housing, and the plans were modest. The first big development was for 100 units, and it got the support of everybody that counted. The Planning Commission and Roland Greeley signed off. All the ministers in town were behind it. It came to town meeting, and town meeting passed it by an overwhelming vote, approved it. It looked like it was set. Except that there's a provision in Lexington law that allows people, if enough of them sign a petition, to demand a referendum. And so they demanded a referendum on this affordable housing. And when people went to vote in the privacy of the voting booth, Lexingtonians voted down affordable housing by a margin of 2-1. It wasn't even close. It was a massive turnout and a massive repudiation. As the Minuteman said in its editorial the next week, it's very clear that if there's ever going to be any kind of affordable housing here, we'll need to go very, very slowly in Lexington. The point of the story is that there was this other tide building too that ran the opposite way of that project about the Great Society and the beloved community, and the watchwords of this other tide were property values, you know. And that was very powerful tide, as it turned out. When I was I went to work at the Minuteman writing stories beginning when I was 14 or 15. Some of you might remember Ann Sigliano, who was the editor of the Minuteman back in those days, and then Mike Rosenberg, who I saw yesterday in Bedford, was my editor for when I was 14 or 15 and first writing stories. And one story that I wrote that almost got me fired from my first job was a story about property values in Lexington. I noted by careful reading of all the real estate ads that the average house in Lexington had in 1975 or 76 passed the $100,000 mark. Now I understand that just seems like the quaintest idea in the possible in the world, but at that time it was a big deal. And so I wrote a story, front page of the Minuteman, you know, average house sale over. Well, the realtors hated it because they said they'd been getting calls from all the people whose homes they were handling that were selling for less than $100,000, and they were annoyed, and so they put pressure on the editor. But it turned out, then as now, that there were enough people deeply interested in, enough readers deeply interested in real estate prices, that it was like the most read story in the paper for weeks. So my job was saved. But in the course of doing the story, I talked to lots of realtors, most of them anonymously, and they kept saying things like, Lexington really is starting to change. It used to have this image as a liberal town, but people are becoming more conservative as the price of property goes up. They're getting more cautious about what happens and so on and so forth. Well, we know which one of these tides wins out. By the end of the decade, Lexington, which had voted, and fairly largely, for George McGovern in 1972, voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980. And that election in 1980, which was the same day that Proposition 2.5, the Massachusetts tax revolt legislation modeled on the one that had passed in California, Proposition 13, 2 years before, that election of 1980, I think, was at least symbolically, and in many ways literally, the kind of moment when we made this decision between these two visions of the world. And the vision that we chose was, at least for a long while, was the one that wasn't about great societies and beloved communities. It was the one that was about individuals, about the idea that market forces would solve all problems, that we didn't need people working together on projects. Remember, Reagan's most famous dictum was that government, which after all is just the word we use for all of us working together to do things, that government was the problem, not the solution. His famous laugh line for decades after decades of speeches was, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. You know, ha, ha, ha. It was his pal, Maggie Thatcher, who said at the same time, same years, said once, there is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women. And that very powerful ideological construct that we should get out of the way and let markets solve problems and things has dominated our political life in this country ever since. Barack Obama, in an exit interview in 2016, asked why he hadn't gotten more done at the beginning when he had 60 senators in his caucus, said, you know, we were still weighed down by the Reagan idea that markets solved problems, governments didn't. You know, there was just real limits on what we could do. So many things stemmed from that set of decisions, including the fact that inequality began to grow and grow with extraordinary rapidity in this country. In the years since the Depression, the onset of the Depression, the inequality in America had steadily narrowed. Wages had become much more equal for CEOs and workers. And that period, which economists call the Great Compression, lasted right until the end of the 1970s. In fact, it was the year I graduated from high school in 1978 was the peak of that Great Compression. And after that, under the influence of this new politics, those gaps, that inequality began to widen and widen very, very dramatically. Among other things, because of American history, that meant that the racial wealth gap in this country widened and widened and widened. And of course, one of the profound reasons, maybe the most profound reason that it widened, was because of what was happening in places like Lexington. The vast explosion in property values that made and remade people's, made people wealthy in a way that we hadn't been before. We were talking about this, Mom and I, because the house that my parents bought on Middle Street for $30,000 in 1970, so $30,000 is about $200,000 in today's money, sold when it sold last a year ago for $1 million. So that $800,000 appreciation wasn't from anything, I mean, it was the same house on the same piece of land. The only thing that had changed was that people who happened to be able to get onto this escalator at the right moment were carried endlessly up by it. But of course, there were lots of people who couldn't get on that escalator at the beginning, including those people who should have been in those affordable housing units that got voted down in this town. So that mechanism and that world, I think that it is fair to look back at periods like the 1970s and see them as decisive decision points about what would happen. I've talked about the consequences of that choice as they relate to our economic life and inequality. But let's talk about them in reference to the gravest problem the world has ever faced, this existential risk about climate that now overwhelms us and that I've spent my life working on. One of the things that interested me in this book was to go back and look at, though we didn't yet know about climate change, obviously the 1970s taught us a lot about energy and the energy crises of that era, and to look at the different responses. And to be reminded once again exactly how prescient Jimmy Carter was in his understanding of where we were going. Carter proposed in his 1980 budget, as he was running for re-election, that the U.S. put the money aside to make America run 20% of its energy from solar power by the year 2000. Now, if we had done that, and there's no technical reason we couldn't have if we'd gone to work in 1980, then the world would be an entirely different place now. We wouldn't have solved global warming, but we'd be very much on the right path. We would have put in place many, many years ago the things that, but we didn't take that path. Instead, Ronald Reagan climbed up, well, not physically, but metaphorically, on the roof of the White House and tore down the solar panels that Jimmy Carter had put there a few years before. And they didn't go back till the very end of the Obama administration. I actually found the solar panels that Carter had put up. They were in a storage in a little college up in Maine, and some students and I took them down to Washington and gave them to the Obama administration and said, you might want to put these back up. But at the beginning, Obama was still so afraid of the kind of legacy of Jimmy Carter that for 4 or 5 years they wouldn't. It wasn't until the end of his administration that he overcame that fear. At any rate, that allows you to understand, I think, the great mystery of climate change, which is why, given very good and comprehensive warning 35 years ago, we decided for decades to do nothing. The U.S. Congress, 2 weeks ago, finally passed the first climate bill it's ever passed. Exactly 34 years and 50 days after James Hansen testified to the U.S. Congress that climate change was real and underway. Instead of taking a year, like it did to get the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act passed, it took just under 35 years, and the Inflation Reduction Act is nowhere near as strong and powerful as the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act were in taking on the challenges they faced. Our belief that markets would solve problems let us step aside while the oil industry pushed a 30-year, incredibly successful campaign of disinformation and delay to keep us from acting, a campaign that continues to this day. And so now we are in very large trouble. I was telling people earlier that I was driving the other night home from giving a talk, and the phone rang, and it was a U.S. senator, someone you all would know, and one of the great progressives in the country and things, and he was saying, you know, just tell it to me straight. I read about Greenland this week, and I read about the Antarctic, the Thwaites Glacier in the Antarctic this week, and is there any real hope left at all? And I was truthfully told him, well, we're in a lot of trouble, and there are things we can do. We are in a lot of trouble. We've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like an enormous amount. I mean, it's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So if it was 75 when we walked in here and 73 when we walk out, no one will be able to tell the difference. But the planet can tell the difference. Think about it in different units. The amount of extra heat that we trap every day near the planet because of the carbon we've put in the atmosphere is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day. And if you think about it in those terms, you start to understand how it's possible that we've melted most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic. I mean, literally, the world does not look like those pictures that came back from the Apollo missions in the 1960s. There's a lot less white up top now, okay? Those pictures are as out of date as my high school yearbook picture is out of date, Fran. So thank you for reminding us what happened to. In fact, in my case, it's just the opposite. I have considerably more white on top now that I'm. So that 1 degree is causing the chaos and convulsion that we see around the planet. Its biggest and most obvious effects so far are related to the simple physical fact that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that in arid areas you get lots more evaporation, and when everything evaporates and then it gets hot, you almost automatically get the kind of forest fires we now see in every arid part of the planet. California, where there's huge fires burning today, but also the Mediterranean, also Australia, also Siberia, also, just you name it. And those fires are horrific, and they produce huge amounts of carbon themselves that amp up this cycle. And once that water is up in the atmosphere, it doesn't last up there very long. Correct me if I'm wrong, Fran, but the average residence time for a molecule of water vapor in the atmosphere is about a week, I think. And that means that it's going to come down quickly, and it's going to come down in deluge. If there's much more water up there in the atmosphere, then the odds of truly huge gully washer kind of storms grow and grow and grow, which is why Hurricane Harvey was able to drop 5 feet of rain on parts of Texas 4 years ago. It is why today, as we sit here in Pakistan, there are 33 million people displaced from their homes by flooding. 33 million people, it's like displacing every American from Boston down to Baltimore or DC. I mean, that's like an almost unimaginable exodus of human beings. An exodus made all the more savage when you remember that, of course, the people who are suffering through it have done literally nothing to cause it. All of Pakistan, which is a couple 100 million people, have produced about 1% of the planet's carbon emissions, compared with the small number of us who live in the US, and we're responsible for about 25% of all the carbon in the atmosphere. And those of us in suburban America are most responsible of all. The suburbanization of America in this period that I'm describing, continuing on to the present, produced the single biggest puff of carbon in the planet's history, even bigger than number 2, the industrialization of China in the early part of this millennium. So, I mean, and all that carbon is still up there heating the planet. I said earlier today, the carbon that I expended the first time I took driver's ed at Lexington High School, and within 2 minutes of getting behind the wheel was instructed to merge at 70 miles an hour onto Route 128, which I completely loved. All that carbon is still up there heating the planet. On our current path, we're headed for 3 degrees Celsius, 5-6 degrees Fahrenheit. If we do that, we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to. The level of violent flux and chaos is simply too high. The UN estimates it produces somewhere between 1 billion and 3 billion refugees. Try to imagine that world. So everything that we're doing now is not to stop global warming. That's too late for that, sadly. Everything we're doing now is to try and hold that warming to as close to 2 degrees as it's still possible to do it. That's not a good outcome. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we're fools to find out what 2 will do, but we're going to find out, or close to it, even if we start doing things right now. But we can start doing things right and at least really get in that fight. We are not without possibilities, as people in this room have begun to realize and begun to act on in powerful ways. I've given you a lot of depressing statistics. Let me give you a very happy one. The price of renewable energy, of power from the sun and the wind and the batteries to store them, has fallen about 90% in the last 10 years. This is remarkable. We live at a moment when the cheapest way to generate power on planet Earth is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is Hogwarts-scale magic, okay? And we should seize on it and get to work with everything we've got. And if we did, the possibilities are remarkable. I wrote a piece for The New Yorker earlier this year arguing that the economics of this has become so compelling that it's quite plausible to imagine humans very quickly ending their 200,000-year career of setting things on fire. It served us well in cave people times. You know, we got to cook meat so we could grow large brains. We were able to move north and south away from the equator. And the anthropologists think that huddling around the campfire at night was a sort of early way for people to start forming the social bonds that mark our species. It was a kind of early version of town meeting, you know. And then it served us well, in a sense, during the Industrial Revolution. When we learned to set coal, gas, and oil on fire, it's what made us rich. But we can't keep doing it. We're destroying the climate. 9 million people a year die just from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. Forget climate change. Just the fact that when you burn stuff, you put particulates in the air and they get sucked. 9 million people is, again, an abstract number. That's 1 human death in 5. That's more than malaria, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, war, terrorism combined. It's way more than COVID, and it's entirely preventable. I mean, the vaccine for dying from particulates is called electric bicycles and electric buses and air source heat pumps and induction cooktops for your kitchen and so on and so forth. And of course, this year, we were reminded of the third reason we'd be very wise to get off fossil fuel, the tight link between autocracy, really fascism, and fossil fuel. I mean, Vladimir Putin was able to invade Ukraine because he sells people oil. 60% of his export earnings come from oil and gas. That's all he's got. Go look in your house and see if you can find some product made in Russia in order to boycott it in some, unless you have an old bottle of Stolichnaya sitting in the back of the liquor cabinet, I predict you will find nothing, because it's just a gas station, you know? And his threat to turn off the taps to Western Europe has allowed him to cow the Germans and the French and things for decades, in the same way that the Saudis have managed to cow us for decades. I mean, this is a country where if they don't like somebody, they cut his head off with a sword, and yet we go and kiss up to him administration after administration, because what choice did we feel we had? Even in our own country, our biggest oil and gas barons, the Koch brothers, took their winnings, used it to buy a political party, and then used that to deform our democracy in profound ways. One of the blessings of renewable energy is it's not like, I mean, the reason that happens is because if you rely on a resource, coal, gas, oil, that's only available in a few places, the people who live on top of them are obviously going to acquire extraordinary amount of power. But the sun and the wind aren't like that. They're everywhere. And, you know, there's no way for Vladimir Putin to turn off the sun, or no way for the Koch brothers to block the wind, you know? So the world that we move to is much more small d democratic. In fact, the economics of all of this is so compelling that given enough time, it's automatically going to happen. 50 years from now, we're going to run the planet on sun and the wind because it's essentially free, or as close to it as we're going to get. But if it takes us anything like 50 years to get there, the planet that we run on sun and wind is going to be a fundamentally broken planet. So our job is to figure out how to make that happen faster, very fast. The world scientists, climate scientists, have told us that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which is 7 years and 4 months away. You know, or as we say now, 29 quarters away from now. Some of that pushing is going to happen and locally, and I am so proud of the work that LexCAN and others have done here to get things going in Lexington. It really has been a great relief to, and I've been following it for years because I've known through Mom people like Mark Sundin who really have gotten us, you know, gotten things going locally and pushed really hard and made a difference and continue to. And that pushing's going to need to continue, and it's going to need to keep coming with changes in attitude, because it gets increasingly a little more, not hard, none of this is very hard, but a little more inconvenient, you know, as we go along. I understand that tomorrow night, or that sometime this week, there's going to be a decision made about putting solar panels on the police station, and that the historical district is a little sad about the prospect. You know what? We really need a slightly different aesthetic sense for the emergency period we are coming into. the notion that we don't want to look at solar panels, the idea that, you know, a few rich landowners in Hyannis were able to block wind farm off the Cape for a decade, that's just not okay anymore, because all of it comes at the expense mostly of people like people in Pakistan who have nothing and have lost whatever nothing they had in the course of the last few weeks. But only some of it can come locally. For those local changes to keep happening, we need to keep setting the national and international framework that allows that to become easier, allows it to work. We need to push hard. We've pushed hard on the political system and gotten some results. A few of us will be at the White House on Tuesday night for this celebration of the passage of this climate bill. I'm mostly going because I've been arrested 4 times outside the White House, and I'm kind of curious what it looks like from the inside. But the But there, we have to keep pushing that system and hard, and then we have to keep pushing hard on the other important system around us, the financial system, which continues to lend huge amounts of money to the fossil fuel industry. I had another story in the New Yorker earlier this year about a fascinating new report that demonstrates just how powerful that is. For the first time, they were able to assign real numbers to how much carbon you get if you keep from the money that's kept in the American banking system. Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, B of A are the 4 biggest lenders in the world to the fossil fuel industry. So if you have 125 grand and it's sitting in the bank in a sort of normal banking system, it's probably producing more carbon as it's lent out to build pipelines and things than all the cooking, flying, heating, cooling, and driving you do in the course of a year. That's pretty amazing. I mean, it's as if you've bought, 3, Escalades, parked them in the driveway, turned them on, and left them run the whole year or something. You wouldn't do that, but we do tend to do. I mean, nobody really thinks about what their money's doing, so we got to start thinking about it. That's one of the questions, or maybe the question on which I'll end here, is who should be doing this pushing at this point? Who is really who should be lining up to do it? And I do think that it's largely the responsibility of those of us who live in the places and have lived the lives that are the fruits of the problem that has gotten us here in the first place. I have a feeling that it might be a good idea to have a new Suburban Responsibility Commission to really begin to think about it in those terms a little bit. People who are comfortable, like me, need not to become uncomfortable, but we need to put ourselves outside our comfort zone. We need to be pushing harder than we have been pushing in order to make things happen. And there's one particular subgroup of people that I really want to talk about in that category, and that's older people like me, people over the age of 60. The lights I can't really see out there, but I'm going to guess that there's at least 4 or 5 of you out there in this same demographic. And so I'm going to talk to you for a moment. Young people have truly been doing their job when it comes to climate change. I started 350.org, which was the first iteration of a global climate movement. I started it when I was in my 40s, but with 7 college students, and they were amazing. We had no idea what we were doing, and there was no framework to build on. There were 7 students. There are 7 continents. Each one of them took one. That's how we went to work. The guy who took the Antarctic was responsible for the internet, too. So, but within 2 years, because we had an unfilled ecological niche, in 2009, we had our first day of action, and there were 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries, including one right here in Lexington. And CNN said it was the biggest day of political action in the planet's history, but that was just the beginning. I mean, at 350, we went on to kind of spearhead this fight around the Keystone Pipeline, which became the first big loss for big oil ever. And then we started this divestment campaign that's become a very, probably the biggest corporate campaign in history. We're at about $40 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. And it has done lots of damage. Shell Oil said in its annual report last year that divestment had become a material risk to its business, which is good because Shell Oil's business is a material risk to life on planet Earth, you know, so that was good. Better yet, since a lot of these campaigns were conducted on college campuses, and we've managed at this point to divest Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and the University of California and pretty much all the colleges in Massachusetts and, you know, except BC. The real product of it, the greatest product of it may have been the young people who were trained themselves as climate fighters along the way. When they got out of school, they wanted to keep working, and so they formed this thing called the Sunrise Project, Sunrise Movement, that brought us the Green New Deal, and it's really that Green New Deal, that audacious proposal that is the kernel of this bill that finally passed. Now it's been, you know, shrunken down by an order of magnitude in the course of getting it passed. But if they had not proposed this huge, big Green New Deal, we wouldn't have gotten anything. And the work that those young people have done is truly astounding. They've been the most politically pragmatic and useful advocates in Washington in recent years. And of course, the same thing is happening around the world. Young people everywhere swung into action. You all know the name Greta Thunberg, and you should. Greta's fantastic. I love working with her. She's one of my favorite people in the world. Completely blunt in every way, and just a master of the politics of gesture. And she'd be the first to say, the real news is there's 10,000 of me around the planet, and there really are. 10,000 great leaders like that. I mean, I was saying yesterday, I set aside a week now every September to write college recommendations for people I think of as close colleagues in my work. You know, they just happen to be 17, and now it's time for them to go to college, you know. And they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids were on school strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit. Really amazing. So that youthful energy is precisely as it should be. They're going to have to live with this, and they have the energy and innovation and intelligence and idealism to figure out the changes. But I listened to a few too many people tell me, well, it's up to the next generation to deal with this, which seemed to me, A, ignoble, and B, impractical. Because the one thing that young people don't have is sufficient structural power to make those changes stick, to make them happen in the time that we have. Those of us over the age of 60 have structural power coming out our ears. And in my case, other things coming out my ears sometimes too. But why? Well, I mean, look, there's 70 million of us, which is bigger than the population of France, okay? But magnify that by the fact that we all vote all the time. There is no known way to prevent old people from voting, okay? And so we have extraordinary power to shift Washington, and we ended up with all the money. Fair or not, baby boomers and the silent generation have 70% of the country's financial assets, compared with about 5% of millennials. So if you want to move Wall Street, if you want to make banks feel some pressure, well, older people are a good place to go there too. So that's why we started this work about 8 months ago at this thing we're calling Third Act, progressive organizing around democracy and climate for people over the age of 60. People haven't done much of this kind of organizing for a long time because the theory has been that people become more conservative as they age. It's an old theory, and I think it's no longer correct because I think that we have advanced the age cohorts that are now represent older Americans are different from the ones that came before. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s now, then, or as at Carlton Willard yesterday, and if a couple of people in their hundreds, your first act, your early years, were actually in this period, not of some, long ago forgotten conservative, they were in the period of epic social and cultural and political transformation. This period when people worked very hard at places like Lexington Green, or in the streets of the South, or in consciousness-raising groups among women, or whatever it was, to change the patterns of this society. You can tell how important these years were because all you need to do is go and look at the things that the reactionaries on the Supreme Court are now targeting. They're all from that time. All the big decisions this year took on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1971, and Roe v. Wade of 1973. We won all those fights, and then I think we sort of assumed that they were won for good and backed off some. Maybe our second act, with plenty of noble exceptions, was a little more focused on consumerism than it was on citizenship, Maybe we were kind of letting it ride, as it were. It's water under the bridge. Now we understand that those fights need to be fought again and differently and even more powerfully. And now we have the resources to do it, the skills acquired over a lifetime to do it. Now we have some time, which we may not have had before, to do it. And now we have, often in the form of kids or grandkids, something that makes that abstract concept of legacy very real and concrete. I mean, your legacy is the world that you leave behind for those that you love the most, and the world that we are leaving behind for them is worse than the one that we inherited, and that is not what anybody wants, and it's not what we need. We can exert power if we push. It doesn't need to be older people leading this fight. I was telling the story this morning that we were doing a big demonstration up outside a bank in northern New England, Chase Bank, the biggest of all the fossil fuel lenders. And there were lots and lots of young people, high school kids that came, because high school kids always come, they completely get this. And they were at the front of the march because they move slightly faster, but at the back of the march, there was a big crowd of third act people marching under a big banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels." And the ability, the moment that when we were talking earlier about when Ricky was talking about those demonstrations that Fran and I were at the beginning of the Keystone Pipeline, that's really where it began. Some of this began to sink in for me. I wrote the letter that asked people to come get arrested at that. And this turned into, that we wouldn't have guessed it, the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in this country for many decades. But when I wrote the letter, I said, I did not think young people should have to be the cannon fodder for this particular fight. Young people are doing most of the work, but if you're 19, well, an arrest record might not be the best thing for your resume. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? And so it was with pleasure that we saw lots of people with hairlines like mine arriving in D.C. We did not say to people, how old are you? That would be rude when they were getting arrested, but we did say, and cleverly, I think, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest groups came from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was old enough that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration. I'd all but forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. It was fantastic for the young people who were there to see their elders acting the way that we need elders to act. It is so It is so dispiriting. It is so dispiriting for young people to think that those in the generations ahead of them are just kind of pulling up the ladder behind them. I wince that my least favorite bumper sticker in the world, least favorite, you see it on RVs and things, and it says, "I'm spending my kids' inheritance." That's that kind of choice that I was talking about that we made in the 1970s, you know, to a kind of, that's that distilled down to a bumper sticker. I'm spending my kids' inheritance. No wonder people walk around saying, "Okay, boomer," you know. And so it's time for us to figure out how to make sure that there's a very different story told, that we tell it, and that we tell it quickly. That's the place I will end, to say that all of this has to happen fast. This is a timed test. A timed test both for climate and for democracy. If we don't cut emissions in half in the next 7 or 8 years, then we're going to miss those targets we set in Paris. If we don't make sure the next few elections go the way that elections are supposed to go, with people respecting the outcomes of them, then we may well surrender our democracy, and once surrendered, it will not be easy to get it back. So now is the time to be doing precisely this kind of organizing. I cannot promise you that we will win these fights, because we do not know. In fact, we know there's going to be big losses. We've put there's a lot of physical momentum built up behind climate change now. I don't know how it will come out in the end, but I can promise you, because I've spent decades now just around the world organizing in every part of the planet, that you have lots and lots and lots of brothers and sisters in every corner of the world who are working hard on this too, and taking great strength from the things that you managed to accomplish, as you should take great strength from the things that they managed to accomplish. This is a movement among all ages, among all kinds of people, trying desperately, I think, to prove that the big brain was a good evolutionary adaptation, or at least that it comes attached to enough big hearts to make it so, to get us out of the deep trouble that we've now fallen into. I just want to say thank you to all of you for being such a huge part of this work, and on we go. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. That's all right. Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions, which I know every single person here has at least 3 or 4 questions. So we have 2 people who will go up the aisles. Raise your hand. We're going to have to cut it short, because Bill will then be signing books if you've bought a book today, or if you haven't bought one, they're for sale out there by Maxima. Bill will sign some books for you. So let's start with the questions.
I think this is on. Yep. Hi, Bill, and wow, and hi for the friends I have in Lexington, most of whom I knew as a select board member in Concord, and we worked on many similar projects. But I have also known you for a long time in my environmental and clean energy work, having done both the policies and then the projects that, on wind and solar over a 25-year period. But it was the frustrations of trying to get a utility-scale solar project sited when gas prices took a dump and suddenly they were cheap in Massachusetts that made me do the numbers again and say, uh-oh, we as humans are going to get on, if we're doing this in the United States, we'll never make it. And that's what brought me and then my group here into fusion, looking at fusion seriously. And I'd love to get your thoughts on fusion, because I do think it is the partner that the renewable industry needs.
Sure. So the question's about nuclear fusion. So and I'll remind people that that means that question's not about nuclear reactors as we understand them at the moment, but about a different version. I'd say just a few things. One, Nuclear power, as we know it now, is also low carbon, but it's also super expensive. So it's not likely to play a big role going forward in what we're going to do. Safety considerations aside, the price of renewable energy has gone like this, and the price of nuclear power has gone like this. Second thing, there are several things on the horizon that 20 years out, 30 years out could make a huge difference. Nuclear fusion is one, geothermal power is one, tidal power is one. These are things we should definitely be putting money into and researching hard. That said, the key task for the next few years has got to be massive deployment of what we have off the shelf ready to go now. We've got to build solar panels and wind turbines and put up batteries in volumes that we've never seen before. And part of it means just what you were saying before about siting and things. We've got to be willing to just suck it up and do it. You know, I mean, and one way to think about that is some of it may well be temporary. If 30 years or 40 years from now, we have great, cheap nuclear fusion, then we'll be able to take down a bunch of those solar panels, and the fields that they're on will have gotten a good rest, and the soils will be healthy, and we'll be ready. But if we don't do this work in the short term, then it's all going to be moot, because we're just going to be putting, you know, nuclear fusion reactors on a dismal and barren planet. So definitely, I'm glad you're doing research on that and working on it, and I hope very much it develops. And in the meantime, for the lifetimes of most of us in this room, most of the job is going to be taking the technology that we now have and putting it to work, and reminding ourselves that as we do so, we are employing the large fusion reactor that the good Lord saw fit to hang 93 million miles up in the sky. So there you are.
Hi, Bill. Could you talk about 32123?
Yes. So the question Lisa asked is about this. I was telling you about the bank work that we're doing, and the kind of most public-facing part of it is going to be we're going to get people are pledging that they will cut up their credit cards from these 4 big banks. The date that we're going to do it is March 21st of next year. Why? What's the great thing about March 21st? It's 3-2-1-2-3. It's just too good a day to pass up. So that's the day, and it's going to be exciting. A lot of it's going to be happening outside banks. People will be up there, you know, protesting, cutting up credit cards, and Chase and Citi and B of A and things have happily, carefully placed 30,000 branch locations in the most highly trafficked parts of America, so you'll be visible and ready to go. But we're also going to have people, you know, underwater against dying coral reefs cutting up credit cards, and people in those fire-scarred California forests cutting them up, and people, you know, using lasers powered by the sun to cut them up, and on and on and on. We're going to make as much of a splash as we can. Not because we can impoverish Chase and Citi. We can't. Chase has 75 million credit card holders. But because we can start doing them enough reputational damage to start making them think. And they're going to have to think, because remember that number I told you about $125,000 in the bank produces as much carbon? Well, that doesn't just go for individuals. That goes for companies, too. I had a piece in the New Yorker earlier this year trying to outline this. Google say, when you do this new calculation, Google's carbon emissions went up 111% overnight because the money that they have sitting in the bank, and they have a lot of money, is being lent out to produce pipelines and things. Apple was up 80%. Company, and these are all companies that have pledged that they're going to go to net zero. And they can't do it as long as these banks that they do business with keep lending them out. But, you know, Google can't really go bank with the Bank of Lexington. They're kind of stuck with the big bank. So at a certain point, their CEO is going to have to sit down with the CEO of Chase and just say, bro, you know, I can't keep the promise I made unless you change your business, so you better decide. You want Google and you want Apple, or you want Exxon. Those are your choices. And faced with that kind of choice, it's very clear to everybody which direction we're going in, that the fossil fuel economy over time is a waning one and the renewable energy economy a growing one. So this is a winnable campaign, though it'll take a while. and a really important and necessary one that puts pressure on one of the key links that keeps us burning stuff when we don't have to.
Hello. Could you say a bit about the relative impact of programs that promote protection of trees versus carbon capture technology?
Yes, the question's about trees and protecting them. You know, there have been all these efforts about people going on and on about we're going to plant lots of trees, which is not a bad idea, but it doesn't solve our problem because there's not enough land on which to plant enough trees. But truly important is protecting the trees that we already have. Not, you know, it's not if you have to cut down a tree in your yard because it's going to fall on your house, don't worry about it. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. But protecting standing forests is crucial because it turns out that big trees get bigger and bigger and bigger, and those are the ones that really sequester lots of carbon. One of the stupidest things that's going on in the world right now is that in the name of renewable energy, people are cutting down trees, turning them into pellets, and burning them in old coal-fired power plants to produce electricity. This has happened. There was a great story in the Times the other day about how this is happening in Europe, but it's also huge forests in the American Southeast are being cut down to make pellets to ship to the UK for this purpose. It's craziness. We need those forests standing so that they can sequester carbon instead of emitting it. And just that goes back to this bottom line question I was describing before. If anybody is coming up with a plan to burn something, it's a pretty good sign that they're trying to evade the basic logic around climate change. We have to stop burning things, natural gas, biomass, coal, oil, whatever it is, and as I say, take advantage of the fact that something else is burning up in the sky and we know how to make full use of it now.
Bill, thank you very much for the presentation. Obviously, getting away from the fossils and into renewables. Oh. There goes the battery. Okay. I saved the good part. Obviously, going away from fossils into renewables is the best way to get us out of the predicament that they have put us in so far. But also, we have all this CO2 that we stored in the atmosphere and the water, which will be there for at least 500 years, and will be eating at the foundation. So sequestration is something that we need to do. And what can you tell us about that? And where would you put it in the priorities list?
Right. So the question's about carbon sequestration and taking out the excess carbon that's already in the air. And this is another one of these technologies that we hope people are able to develop in a reasonable way. It's not easy because think of the physical problem involved in it. You've got the atmosphere, which has a lot of carbon in it, but not a lot in terms of concentration. We're talking 420 parts per million. So it's a difficult problem to figure out how you get something that dilute out of the atmosphere. People are building machines now that do direct air capture of fossil fuel, but so far those machines are so expensive and so unwieldy that they're not yet doing it. We should definitely be trying to research this to see if we can. The kind of carbon sequestration we should not be doing is the kind that the oil industry and the coal industry want to do now, and they've got some money from Joe Manchin in this new bill to do it, and that's to take existing coal-fired power plant and stick an expensive chemistry project on the top that takes the carbon as it comes out of the smokestack and pumps it underground into a salt mine, or worse, into an oil well to help push more oil to the surface. That just makes no sense, no economic sense at all. It's already cheaper to put up a solar plant or a wind farm than it is to build a coal-fired power plant. Now imagine how expensive it is when you've added all this extra plumbing to the coal-fired power plant to capture the emissions. So that kind of sequestration we should avoid. We should be researching hard that stuff like direct air capture. But really what we've got to be doing above all is putting no more into the atmosphere. That's the key job right now. That's the job that we, you know, I mean, I at this point in my life don't think more than a decade or so ahead, you know, and in the next decade, that is the key work. Making this transition that we're capable of making at tremendous speed, way faster than we're going now. When I say fast, I mean fast like in those couple of years before World War II, when America figured out how to build bombers and ships and tanks at an ungodly rate that won us the war. Now we need to learn how to build air source heat pumps and install them. We need to learn how to build solar panels and install them. We need to do all these things. They're not by any means impossible, and it's not like these technologies are, you know, I mean, it's the electric vehicle you end up driving is nicer than the car you're driving now, so it's not a, you know, but it has to happen. It has to happen now. Vested interest and inertia have to be overcome, and they can only be overcome when people build power. That requires building movements big enough to matter, and that's why it's so important. If you're under 30, go find the Sunrise Movement. If you're over 60, join us at Third Act. Find the Citizens Climate. Find anybody who's working on this stuff and join in with them. We think about always our own individual lives. I'm happy that my house is covered with solar panels and that they connect to my electric car and on and on and on. But I do not try to fool myself that that's how we're going to solve this. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together in movements big enough to matter. That was the point I was trying to make at the very beginning. It's our fixation on this kind of hyper-individualism of all kinds that got us in the place where we are now. It's got to be a return to some kind of solidarity and some kind of community that allows us to see our way out. And that's why it's really inspiring to be in Lexington, where people have begun to work hard on this. Thank you for what you've done already. Thank you for what you'll do going forward.
Just to